Black veteran faces racism in restaurant, but his son's response shocks the town. One act of discrimination at a nearby diner starts an unforeseen series of events in a close-knit community. Longtime proprietor makes a serious mistake when he declines service to a revered veteran, leaving wounded by. The owner believes the matter is resolved, but he couldn't be more wrong knowing what he does. Caught the interest of someone capable of contesting the town's ingrained. The prejudices that follow will astound everyone and impart a strong lesson about pardon and change. Before we delve into this amazing tale, let us know in the comments from where you're viewing now, and remember to subscribe. Robert Lewis, if you enjoy this narrative. She seems tired. Sigh as he dragged his aged body out of his reliable old pickup vehicle. His joints protested flashbacks of the years he had spent serving his nation. The warm southern sun hammered down on his weary face as he looked up at the faded sign of Bill's Diner. A little smile pulled at the corners of his mouth. He has been visiting this location for years, attracted by the promise of excellent cuisine and pleasant smiles. As Joan opened the door, the familiar tinkling of bells declared his arrival, and the scent of fresh coffee and the air laden with sizzling bacon made his tummy growl in expectation. He moved toward his regular counter spot, bowing gently to the other Cuzbillers as he went past. But something felt different today. The Cuzbillery buzz of discussion seemed to fade as he arrived, replaced by an John could sense uncomfortable quiet as eyes followed his every action he took. Wanted to get rid of the uncomfortable sensation, attributing it to his old solders. Paranoia. As Robert sat on a stool at the counter, he saw Bill Thompson, the diner proprietor, coming out of the kitchen. Usually, Bill's face wrinkled in a warm smile, but his expression was set in a harsh, hostile line. His eyes, icy and far, stared at John with a force that caused the elderly veteran to move uneasily in his seat. What might I get for Robert Billis today? Gruff lactates. John's typical friend chose to overlook Bill's change in attitude and smiled politely. Just the usual, Bill. Cup of coffee and a slice of that renowned apple pie of yours. Bill's jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he grabbed the counter's edge. I worry that won't be. Robert, we are all out of pie today. John's forehead wrinkled in perplexity. Bill, I can see where. He could plainly see a newly made apple pie resting on the counter a few feet away. Out. Bill's voice rose sharply, startling many Cuzbillers in astonishment. In reality, we are shutting early today. You will have to leave. A terrible hush falling over the restaurant. John sat frozen, trying to understand what was going in. All his years later, Bill's Diner would never treat him like this. The other patrons moved uncomfortably in their chairs. Some people hide their eyes, while others, watching the event develop, combined shock with Bill. I gently stood up, John's worn hands shaking slightly. His obsessive curiosity. Bill's face twisted into an unpleasant scowl. I did something to annoy you? You've done plenty simply by walking in here. I don't serve your kind in my place now. Get out before I have hit JN like a physical blow. Stumbled back, eyes closed, calling the authorities. Wide with pain and incredulity. For a minute, he was taken back to his boyhood, to a period when such treatment was all too frequent. But this was unique. Bill, and man he had thought of as a friend, would have years. As John approached the door, his shoulders dropped in discouragement. A young woman seated at an adjacent table got up. This isn't right. Her voice trembles. You cannot treat him like this. Bill rounded on her, his face flushed with rage. My diner will run. If you like it, you can leave too. The woman hesitated for a second. She sat back, caught between her need to defend what was right and her anxiety of confrontation. At last, she watched John shuffle out of the eyes full with guilt, ashamed. Restaurant. As the door closed behind John, burst into a whirl of whispers. Some Cuzbillers fled unhappy to support such obvious discrimination. Others stayed, with quickly paying their bills, either too startled to move little or in line with Bill's actions. Bill knew his act of preference would start a sequence of events that, if just slightly, would undermine the fundamental basis of their small village. He knew Robert Lewis's true nature and the strong ties he possessed, hence he would have considered double his deeds. But Bill Thompson had just committed the worst mistake of his life, and the fallout would be about to fall down on him like a tidal wave as Robert Louis made his unhurried approach. His thoughts was whirling from what had just happened, the bright sunlight that had been so consoling. His truck, earlier, now seemed to mock him, stressing the stark realism of the prejudice he just encountered. He ascended into. John sat there, and his hands shook as he held the steering wheel for a long while. Blankly ahead, the anguish and humiliation swept over him in waves, threatening to drown him in hopelessness, but suddenly his jaw set in nearly undetectably changed attitude. Robert Louis was many things depending on his will, and the fire lit in his eyes. Veteran, a parent, a valued member of the society, however, he was not a man to accept injustice lying down as he started. Though John's mind was already developing a strategy, he might have been ejected out of Bill's diner. This was far from over. Little did Bill Thompson know, but his behavior now would start a series of events that would transform their tranquil small town's everything. Bill Thompson was experiencing the instant reaction of his actions. Several frequent patrons back at the cafe had walked out, some disapproving glares as they departed, but Bill held his ground, his face set in a why did he feel the scoring? He had done what his father would have wanted, what he thought was right. Unease in the pit of his gut as the day progressed about what had occurred at Bill's diner, gathering small groups on street projects across the town like wildfire. Their voices quiet in front yards and corners as they spoke about the startling incident. Robert Louis was a well-known. Many in the community, who had always appeared so kind, couldn't believe Bill could harbor such ingrained prejudice, although one person in particular heard the news and developed a fury unlike anything he had ever known before. Daniel Louis Roberts' son was in his Washington, D.C. office when he got the call from a family friend back home. As he listened to the narrative about his father, Daniel's phone grasp becoming tighter till his knuckles went white. Daniel Louis was not any ordinary worried son. He was a potent U.S. Senator, well known for his advocacy of veterans' rights and civil liberties, who had battled ceaselessly to produce a more fair and egalitarian society, and today his own father had been exposed to such obvious prejudice. The irony was not lost on him and simply strengthened his will to right this wrong as Daniel's call came to an end. His mind racing, he could utilize his position to bring the whole might of the law down on Bill Thompson, might set an example of him demonstrating to the world that this kind of behavior would not be accepted. But as enticing as that was, Daniel knew that such behavior usually simply helped to widen rifts and foster more anger. This condition is called. Daniel leaned over, grabbing his phone once again. Then he had some calls to make, some favors to call in Bill Thompson. He had no idea what was ahead, but Daniel was resolved to impart a knowledge of lesson he would never forget as the sun started to drop on the small southern town, creating long shadows. The stage was prepared across the streets for a conflict that would rock the town to its very foundation. The acts of one prejudiced men were going to squarely meet the will of a son defending the dignity of his father, and when the dust settled, nothing would always be different. What occurred next would shock everyone in town, will impart a strong lesson about the fallout from bias. But before we proceed, make sure you're enjoying this narrative and therefore ensure thumbs up this video and follow our channel to get more amazing true tales of justice. And though the next morning dawned brilliant and beautiful, there was a tension in the air that seemed to spark like electricity. Word of Robert Louis's treatment at Bill's diner had traveled far and wide, and Bill Thompson arrived at his diner, and the community was humming with conjecture about what would happen next. Early, as he always did to begin the daily preparations, but when he got to the front door, he saw something unusual. A small group of people had gathered outside, displaying posters stating no to racism and equality for all. Bill's face heated with rage as he passed them, opening the door with quivering hands. Inside, Bill sought to leave about his regular schedule, but he couldn't get rid of the sensation that something major was approaching, and leaped at every jingle of the bell over the door, partly hoping to see the cops or Robert Louis enter. Yet as the morning went on and nothing happened, Bill started to unwind, perhaps thinking this would all blow over shortly. Bill's respite was fleeting. Just as Bill looked up and his heart almost stopped, the lunch rush started. The bell over the entrance jingled once again. He was a man he did not know, standing in the doorway, but he sensed something about him that demanded attention, was tall, well-dressed, and held himself with an authority that struck. Apprehensive, the stranger headed to the counter, his eyes darting the diner until they landed on Bill. "You, Bill." Thompson desired his voice to be cool, but with a little edge of. Steel Bill nodded, not sure he could speak. The stranger's eyes closed. Mildly as he examined Bill's features, Daniel Lewis stated, and Bill felt his. "I think we should talk about Blood Run's cold Robert Lewis's kid. About what transpired here yesterday." Bill's mind flew. He had heard. Stories that Joe had a political-minded son were dismissed as small-town legends anymore. But, confronted the reality, Bill sensed a flutter of anxiety, yet his pride, and profoundly felt. Entrenched prejudices swiftly destroyed it. "Look," Bill said, gruff, "I don't know your identity, but this is my establishment. I have the right to refuse service to anyone I pick." Daniel's demeanor remained neutral, but there was a deadly glitter in his eyes. "That so?" he whispered gently. "And on what basis did you deny my father, a decorated warrior living in this community longer than you have been living?" Bill's face flushed red. "I am not here to explain myself to you," he spat. "Your father and those like him are not welcome here." End of story. A silence descended the diner. The other Cusbillers watched the exchange. Fascinated and terrified, Daniel Lewis stood still with his eyes never leaving Bill's face as he spoke once again. His voice was quiet and under control, but bursting with "I had hoped," but quiet fury made Bill involuntarily step back. "Mr. Thompson," Daniel murmured, "we might have a reasonable conversation about this, but I now realize that won't be feasible. Let me be quite clear. What not only was yesterday morally repugnant, but it was illegal, and I plan to make sure you pay for the results of your actions using all the tools at hand." Bill's swagger wavered momentarily. "What then do you mean you cannot?" Daniel grinned. "But this is my business. Do anything to me." It was a harsh, hard expression devoid of warmth. "Mr. Thompson," responded, "you have no notion. I'm a United States Senator and have devoted my career to Robert Lewis. I'm not only his son." Battling precisely the type of discrimination you shown yesterday, the color faded from Bill's face when Daniel's words landed on him. He had kicked out a U.S. Senator's man with the power to make his life extremely very tough. "This isn't over," Daniel remarked. "You'll be hearing from me once more very soon." As the door closed behind Daniel, turning to depart, the cafe burst into whispers as Bill stood still behind the counter and realized what he had done and who he had offended finally sank in. He had believed he was defending his opinions for the ideals his father had ingrained in him, but today confronted with, Bill started to question if those values were worth the cost he could have to pay. Bill had no idea, but Daniel Lewis's visit marked only the start of the wheels of justice already spinning, and Bill's life was going to be upside down in ways he could never have predicted the small southern town could bring. About to be the focus of a storm challenging ingrained preconceptions and driving everyone to face the gloom that hid under their calm exterior. As Daniel Lewis's polished shoes clicked against the sidewalk outside Bill's diner, he grabbed out his phone and made a call. "It done," he remarked, "exactly as stubborn and prejudiced as we could have found." Thought time to enter the diner. Bill Thompson was in phase 2 inside. Man on the brink shook as he tried to pour coffee for a Cusbiller, spilling half of it on the counter. The weight of what had just happened descended upon him like a physical presence. He had always known to be a nice man, cornerstone of the society, but now confronted with the results of his acts, uncertainty started. Bill couldn't get rid of the sensation that his entire universe was about to come collapsing as the day carried on. Flinched half, expecting the bell above the door jingled to down around him. See federal agents or attorneys racing in, but it was worse than that. Instead of the spectacular showdown, he was afraid of Bill encountered something considerably more sinister. The silent judgment of his years of regular patrons from his diner avoided his eyes, others not showing up at his eatery. Every one of them that did came in subdued, their normal friendly conversation placed. Bill could practically sense their wordless glances on him. Awkward silences. Condemnation. As closing time neared, Bill collapsed into a chair, his head in hands, the cafe normally humming with For the first time, Bill let himself let the dinner crowd be hauntingly vacant. Think about the likelihood that Robert committed a horrible error across town simultaneously. Surrounded by vintage pictures and mementos from his time in the service, Lewis sat in his little living room, found a framed picture of himself and his late wife taken on the day he returned from the war, and both have looked so young. Oh, Margaret, full of hope for the future, running a SED. Finger over her happy face. What would you say if you could see what's happening? Now John from his reverie was startled by the sound of a car approaching the driveway. Father and son embraced the silent moment later as the front door opened. Daniel entered. How did it go? Robert questioned, pain of previous events hanging heavily between them. Daniel's jaw tightened as he settled into his chair about as. Although Dad is not likely to change his mind quickly, don't panic. We have A. Robert nodded slowly. I simply never imagined it would come to this, Bill and me. Though we were not close friends, I always felt that our mutual respect let me discover that all this time he had seen me as less than human due to my skin tone. Hurt, son, it hurts. Deep. Daniel leaned closer, grabbing his father's worn hand in his own eye. No, Dad. This is why we cannot let this stand. What happened to you? It is about every person, not only about you. Of race in this town, in this nation, where daily discrimination still exists, calls for our intervention. Robert gazed at his kid and saw the same fire, that same will to fight for justice, that had propelled him in. His adolescence, he experienced a surge of pride mixed with a trace of. Though he was glad Daniel had the strength, this was not the planet he had planned to leave for his son. And the posture to advocate for change. What then is the next step? Robert asked. Daniel's voice now was more forceful. His eyes shimmered with a mix of will and something more. Of a scheme currently under progress. Well, Dad, that's where things get fascinating, you see. After a little research, it comes out our guy Bill is slightly in financial difficulty. His diner is not performing as he would like others to believe. He has been attempting to sell it for actually years. John's eyebrows rose in surprise. Selling the cafe? It's been in his family for generations. Daniel agreed perfectly, which is why he has been so reluctant to let it go. However, given the incident today, I believe he may be more receptive to the concept, particularly if the proper offer comes along. Robert leaned back in his chair, his brow wrinkled in contemplation. What are you? Let's just say, planning, son. Daniel's smile was both deliberate and rather naughty. Bill Thompson is poised to accept an offer he cannot turn down. As the dust settles, diner is likely to become a sign of something much different from what it denotes now as night descended over the small village. Though Bill Thompson knew nothing, the seeds of change had been sown, and his world was about to be inverted in ways he could never have predicted. The approaching days would challenge the basic foundation of the society, demanding everyone to face their own prejudices and assumptions. The following morning, Bill got at his diner earlier than usual and had troubled by enraged public and legal summons. As he unlocked the main door, he observed a trembling hand slid a hefty envelope under him, which he took up and tore open. Inside was a formal-appearing document. Bill's face turned pale as his eyes went over the contents. It was a purchase offer for his eatery for almost twice the market value. Anonymous made an offer through a law firm he did not know. At the bot bill of the letter was a message stating this offer depends on your immediate departure and is time-sensitive from the premises, and agreed not to open another business in the vicinity. Bill's thoughts whirled. Who would make such a gift, and why now? As much as he hated to say the diner had been, years of struggle had left him more often thinking of selling than once, but he had always pushed it off, clinging to the legacy his father had bequeathed him, but now confronted with a possible fallout from his confrontation with Robert Lewis and his kid, the offer appeared as a lifeline away from the mess he had produced. But something about the timing felt too convenient, the conditions too particular. As Bill stood there lost in contemplation, the bell over the door jingled. He looked up to find Sarah, his longtime waitress, walking. In the instant she spotted him, halted short with a wary look. Bill, you seem to have seen a ghost. Quickly pushed the letter into I'm good in his pocket. He muttered angrily, just a lot on my mind. Sarah nodded, her eyes flickering with a mix of disappointment and worry. "Bill, regarding yesterday's actions to Mr. Lewis, it wasn't appropriate. Many people are discussing this and claiming they won't return to the diner." Bill felt a flash of wrath. "It's my diner. I can serve whomever I wish." Sarah gasped at his tone, and Bill immediately regretted his outburst, ran a hand over his graying hair, and felt every one of his ears. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I didn't mean to snap at you. It's just that everything is falling apart, and I have no idea how to fix it." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Perhaps you could start by apologies to Mr. ACC Lewis. It's not too late to correct things." Bill's jaw tightened with the idea of apologizing to Robert Lewis when, against all he had been taught to believe, his father's voice rang in his brain, loaded with resentment and prejudice. Yet for the first time, Bill started to wonder about those long-held opinions. As the day went on, the diner stayed absolutely silent. Bill found himself with far too much time to consider the note in his pocket. Normal lunch bustle never came. Burn, a continual reminder of the choice Daniel Lewis had to make across town. He was in Daniel's discussion with a group of neighborhood leaders had the room bursting with a mixture of wrath and resolve. Daniel said, laid out his plan. "What happened to my father is not an isolated incident." Voice consistent but passionate. "This suggests a more serious issue in our society, but we have chances here to convert this into a spark for transformation." An elderly woman heading the local NP chapter leaned forward. "What exactly are you suggesting, Senator Daniel?" "We will be purchasing bills." Someone questioned why, and the room shook with a murmur of surprise. "Would we want to do that?" Because Daniel clarified, "We will be turning it into something fresh. A venue that gathers people rather than separates them, a representation of togetherness and advancement right in the middle of." Daniel described his idea, and the vibe in the room started to change. "Our town." As others started to understand the possibilities in his idea, doubt gave way to excitement. Robert Lewis sat on his front porch, lost in contemplation. The events of the past several days had brought memories he had long sought to ignore alive. Closed his eyes, and then he was back in Vietnam's jungles, surrounded by anarchy of conflict in mind's eye. He once again observed the face of Bill Thompson, his fellow soldier and companion. They had fought side by side, depending on one another to survive in a world gone insane. Yet then arrived that fatal day, the day that turned everything. John remembered the new black soldier fresh out of basic training who had been terrified by the savagery of battle and in a panic attack had made a terrible error, a error that claimed several men's life, including Bill Sr.'s best friend. The anguish and resentment that followed had corrupted Bill Sr.'s mental state. He had converted that suffering into hatred, blaming not only the young soldier, but all black people for his loss. John had seen helplessly as his friend fell under bitterness, unable to transcend his suffering to the greater reality that war was the Robert opened his eyes, returning real enemy, not the hue of a man's skin. He was deeply depressed right now, knowing now where Bill Jr.'s prejudice sprang from, a heritage of suffering handed down from father to son, but understanding did not make it right. Robert realized that the cycle had to be broken if there was ever going to be actual transformation. Shattered at the diner, Bill was closing for the evening, heard a tap at the door, looked up to saw Daniel Lewis was momentarily standing outside. Bill thought of. Bill unlocked the door, pretending he hadn't noticed him, but stopped with a deep sigh at something in Daniel's eyes. "We're closed." Gruff. Daniel nodded. "I know I'm not here as a client. Mr. Thompson came here to discuss." Bill stopped momentarily, then moved aside to let Daniel in. The two men stood in the vacant diner, the weight of prejudice and history hanging heavily between them. "I know about the offer you got," Daniel mentioned without a preamble. Bill's eyes were wide with surprise. "How did you do it?" "Not important," Daniel cut him off. "What counts is what you're." Bill's shoulders dropped. "I'm not sure he mentioned this spot. All I have here." "Daniel, the legacy of my father has somewhat changed. It is indeed the legacy you wish to preserve, the legacy of division and hate." A Bill flicked at the words, but he let himself really explore the ideas he had been carrying for the first time. He couldn't ignore their truth. "So long. What do you want from me?" Bill questioned, his voice just over a Daniel moved closer. "I want you to make a decision, Mr. Thompson. To be better than your father in ending the cycle of hate and beginning afresh." When Bill stared into Daniel's eyes, he saw not criticism or judgment, but a flash of hope, and in that instant, he felt the first stirrings as something changed inside him. The barriers he had created around his heart started to fall apart. Bill knew little about change, but his choice at that time would start a sequence of events that would not just change his life. The road forward would not be followed by the whole community. Simple, but it promised healing for a town long split by the shadows of the past as well as atonement. Bill Thompson waited outside his diner, keys in hand, as the sun rose on another day. He took a long breath, steeling him personally for what he was about to do. With a quivering hand, he unlocked the door and entered for what he knew could be his last encounter with the familiar scent of grease and coffee. It brought with it a flood of emotions. He recalled his father standing behind this identical counter, training him in how to. Around the place, he could practically hear laughing from better days before hate and prejudice had set in. Poisoned everything Bill produced, dragging heavily toward the office. He pulled out the offer letter, reading it over one more time, then with great care from the squeaky old chair behind the desk. Bill Thompson sighed and picked up the phone, dialing the number at the bot bill of the page. He stated, his voice sharp with feeling, "I'm phoning on the offer to purchase my diner II." As Bill hung up the phone, he experienced an odd mix of sadness and relief. Over him, it was done. The cafe his family had owned for generations would quickly start to belong to someone else. Yet along with the grief, there was also a flash of something else, hope for a fresh start, a possibility to surpass his past. Daniel Lewis's phone buzzed with a text message he could have read across town. He told his father fast, a little smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. Sitting across from him at the breakfast table, Bill turned down the offer. Robert Lewis nodded slowly, his look careful, and then he inquired Daniel's. Dad's smile widened now. "It's time to move on phase 2 of the scheme. That diner into something that will unite this town rather than driving it apart over the next 4 weeks." Buzzed with activity and conjecture, the news that Bill Thompson had sold his diner swiftly went about, and stories of who. Some claimed it was a large chain restaurant arriving in town, while others murmured it was became a sophisticated coffee shop, but the reality turned out to be sunny when it was at last exposed to everyone. When the recently remodeled diner opened Saturday morning, a throng had gathered outside, inquisitive to see what changes had been done by noon. The doors opened and gasps of a pleasant smile on Robert Lewis's face revealed astonishment rippling through the throng gathered in the gateway. Robert remarked, his voice clear and strong, "Welcome the veteran." Table the audience muttered in uncertainty and astonishment. Robert Lewis, the very man. Robert, the owner of this diner, had been booted out just weeks earlier. Now he moved aside to welcome everyone. And see for yourself, as individuals entered, they were met with a totally changed environment with barriers. Were decorated with pictures and relics from many wars honoring veterans from all backgrounds and races. The reupholstering booths in a rich blue evocative of military uniforms. The most striking modification was the huge painting on the rear wall showing a varied collection of soldiers shoulder to shoulder, their faces engraved. Driven and with friendship at the mural's core were two figures, a young black soldier and a young white soldier, whose arms across each other's shoulders. To those familiar with the tale, the similarity to young Robert Lewis and Bill Thompson Sr. was clear as people absorbed the modifications JN made en route to the middle of the room. Friends, neighbors started his speech with great emotional resonance. "This diner has long been a feature of our town, but today we also change it to reflect modern divide and prejudice." Robert later went on to say that we transform it into a venue of unity, understanding, and healing. The Veterans Table would be a communal hub rather than just a restaurant where veterans might come for assistance, and where individuals from many origins could get together to share meals and tales. There would be consistent. As Robert spoke to the audience, events aimed at fostering empathy and dismantling barriers. People started to nod, some wiping away from first disbelief, then excitement. Tears. The diner's mood changed with a feeling of hope and opportunity, but one more surprise in store as Robert concluded his speech. Now I would motion toward the kitchen. Like introducing you to our new head chef. The kitchen doors opened and a silence descended when the assembly of people sporting immaculate white chef's uniforms was. Bill Thompson. Bill moved ahead, his eyes downcast, his shoulders bowed as though expecting a blow. But when he glanced up at last, he was met not with judgment or wrath, but with a sea of inquisitive faces. I am most likely the last person you expected to see here, Bill started, his voice unsteady, and I know I shouldn't be forgiven what I did. I thought it was quite improper, quite dreadfully. Bill's voice grew stronger as he carried on. JN and Daniel Lewis have given me an opportunity. One do not deserve to learn to develop, to be better than I was, and I swear you I will spend every day attempting to gain the confidence they have in me. The diner stopped as Bill's words sank, and then someone started clapping, others joined in, and shortly the room was overflowing with applause. It was not pardon, not. Yet it was respect of the challenging trip Bill was on, and the bravery required to own his errors. In front of the applause died down, Robert came forward once more. This is what the veterans experienced. Table is all about, he said. It's about healing old wounds and creating a better future. It's about second chances. United, and I hope you will all be involved with that, Robert announced. The diner officially open as people started to mix food and explore the new area. There was a clear vibe. Old walls were crumbling, conversations were commencing, and a community was starting to grow out of change. Bill worked with his new team in the kitchen, healing in the diverse collection of people. Before he felt weight lifting off his shoulders with every meal he made, he would never have given hiring any thought. Every smile he got was a reminder of the long and challenging path ahead, but Robert and Daniel Lewis felt hope for the first time in years. Stood back observing their vision come to reality. Do you think it would be useful, Dad? Daniel questioned softly. Robert grinned, his eyes glittering. It's a start, son, a good start, and sometimes all you need to transform the world. As the Veterans Day progressed, his table buzzed with activity. Folks who had never spoken to each other before were now sharing tables, swapping stories, establishing common ground as the walls separating the community for so long started to fall apart. One talk at a time. In the weeks and months that followed, the Veterans Table got more. From a diner, it evolved into a symbol of hope and change for the whole community, drawing people regularly together to address challenging subjects spanning divisions that had existed for generations. Bill Thompson, true to his pledge, put great effort to gain the confidence of the community he listened to, and though he evolved gradually, people started to view him not as the biased man he had described has been, but evidence of the ability of atonement. The narrative of the warriors transcends national boundaries. Their tiny town news sources caught the tale, amazed by the change of both the diner and its former owner. A documentary filmmaker even visited Robert and Daniel regarding sharing their narrative with a larger audience, but maybe the most potent moment arrived almost a year after the diner reopened. Bill Thompson Sr., who had been living in a nursing home in another state, came to visit, feeble and wheelchair-bound. Robert rolled Elder Thompson into the diner, a shell of the powerful, bitter man he had once been. Bill Sr.'s eyes grew wide in disbelief as he studied the artwork featuring the varied group his son was working alongside that he would have hated, and first started to cry. Bill Thompson Sr. in decades was wrong. I had been so for all these years, grabbing junk hand. Wrong that day, surrounded by the coziness and unity of the veteran table. Old wounds started to heal. Bill Sr. shared stories of his time spent in the conflict, told from a fresh viewpoint rather than with resentment, revealed the anxiety, the anarchy, the common humanity of warriors on all sides. As the sun sank on that amazing day, Robert Lewis stood outside the cafe staring up the sign now displaying the veteran table, considering the lengthy path that had led them to this point, the suffering, the times of doubt all had resulted in. Still humming with activity inside the diner, Robert could see Bill Sr. through the window. Surrounded by a gathering of veterans from many backgrounds, both young and elderly, they were attentively listening to him speak. John felt a touch on his shoulder and turned to find Daniel nodding in comprehension and providing words of support. "You did it, Dad," Daniel remarked gently, standing next to him. "You changed everything." John shook his head and gave him a soft smile. "We did this, son. All of us standing there observing the action inside the diner, neither of which. They may have seen the wider world's knock-on effects from their activities, but the narrative of the Veterans Table was far from over. In fact, it was about to start a new chapter that would impact life well beyond their modest means. Southern Town the next morning, while Robert was getting ready to open the diner he acquired. Unexpectedly, it was from a producer on a big news network. They intended to create a feature narrative on the Veteran Table and the amazing change it had spurred in the. At first, JN was reluctant. He hadn't done all of this for accolades or glory, but, as he considered it, came to see that telling their tale could motivate others to act in such manner in their own communities. With that in mind, he agreed to the interview. The day the news crew arrived, the entire village looked to be buzzing with enthusiasm. Cosbillers gathered outside the cafe in search of a view of the cameras and perhaps even personally interview. John sat at one of the booths, the mural of several troops acting as a striking backdrop against the. The interview started when he spoke from the heart about the event that had set off all the suffering of confronting such clear-cut prejudice and the choice to answer with love and empathy instead of rage. It would have been simple to react to hatred with more hatred. John mentioned his voice consistent and distinct, but that would have simply helped to prolong the cycle instead. After deciding this presented a chance for development and healing, the reporter turned to Bill Thompson, who had joined them at the booth. Bill's hands shook gently as he started to talk, but his voice got stronger as Bill stated, his eyes sparkling, sharing his tale of metamorphosis. "I was raised with specific values. With unshed tears, beliefs I now know were mistaken. It took this experience and the amazing grace Robert shown and Daniel Lewis to open my eyes. I'm working, but I'm not proud of who I was every day to be someone I can be happy of." As the interview went further, other community members participated in sharing their personal experiences of how the Veterans Table had transformed their viewpoints and brought individuals together who might not have crossed paths before. The reporter, moved by the stories she was hearing, asked John what message he hoped people would absorb from their experience. John considered for a before answering, "I hope people would realize that transformation is possible even in the face of strongly rooted preconceptions. It's not simple and it doesn't happen overnight, yet with patience and a readiness to see the humanity in every one of us allows us to create a better planet." As the news crew packed there was a buzz of expectation around the equipment, since everyone knew that if their narrative went public, things might never be the same, and they were right. The feature tale shown on a Sunday evening during prime time as millions of people all over tuned in to the story of the journey of a small southern town. From discord to unity, the response was instantaneous and overwhelmingly strong on social media. Burst with responses, phone lines at the network were inundated with calls, and the Veteran Table started to trend topic. During the next days following, the diner was overrun with guests from people drove for hours, even days, all over the nation in order to visit the site for themselves and experience the environment of healing and acceptance produced there. But it was not only inquisitive travelers lured to the diner. Community leaders from other towns and cities started to get in touch, keen to learn how they may carry out like initiatives in their own local fields. Robert and Daniel discovered were fielding calls and letters from individuals all throughout the nation looking for guidance on how to heal divisions and advance harmony in their communities. The influence of their narrative extended well beyond anything any group of filmmakers could have dreamed. Asked them to do a documentary covering more general concerns than simply the Veterans Table. As filming started, Robert, Daniel, forgiveness of discrimination and community healing, and Bill found themselves going back over the circumstances that had brought them to this point. It wasn't always easy reliving some of the traumatic events brought back challenging feelings, but they also highlighted their distance and resolved themselves to keep on working, and the documentary team followed them for months, recording the daily running of the diner, community events they sponsored, and continuous healing and personal development process. They spoke with veterans from places who had discovered a home at the Veterans Table, as well as some of those who had first dubious of the modifications. One of the most poignant events occurred during their discussion with Bill Thompson. when the elder Thompson's health was failing, but his mind bright spoke with. Frank honesty about the causes of his prejudice and the transforming power of the love and pardon he experienced carried so much resentment for so long. Bill Sr. reported his voice was faint, but his eyes clear. I let one dreadful time in conflict determine how. I saw a whole bunch of people, but being here witnessing what my son and Robert had created together, it's opened my eyes. I only wish I had known this lesson sooner as the documentary approached. Completion News of It Productions distributed, generating even more expectation. Important film events expressed interest in premiering it, and although Oscar potential was discussed for Robert Daniel and Bill the Actual, the measure of success was not in honors or acclaim, but in the little daily improvements they observed in their community and in the narratives they came across from those motivated by their. One evening following a long filming session, John sat at the counter of the Veteran M table nursing a cup of coffee. The diner was silent, the last patrons. Bill went for the evening and was in the kitchen finishing some while Daniel sat close by. Paperwork, Robert mentioned, disrupting the pleasant stillness. When all this happened, I never could have anticipated. Where Daniel turned from his papers to find a smile playing on his lips. You mean you didn't see Envision rising to become a national emblem for racial healing and community healing? Robert laughed, shaking his head hardly. I just wanted to stand up for what was right, to demonstrate that love could transcend hate. Bill came out of the kitchen, washing his hands on a towel, and looked. What that stand has produced, Robert, mine, most of which has altered many lives surrounding the diner. All Jan stretched out, clutching Bill's shoulder. We have all changed, Bill. This is the beauty of it. Travel with them as they sat there, three men who had formerly been on opposing sides of a deep division, now united in goal they couldn't help but feel wonder at. Little did they realize, but their road had taken them far away. Over the release of the documentary would propel their narrative into the global scene, motivating movements for change and reconciliation in ways they had never believed possible. But as they say, another tale. The debut of the documentary, named Table. Robert Daniel and Bill discovered in a packed auditorium in New York City that the veterans' table story was of brotherhood. Themselves strolling the red carpet, none of them had ever dreamed of when they settled into the darkness. Theater, encircled by film business elites, leaders in civil rights, and media personalities, reportedly felt a mix of excitement and anxiety about how their tale would be told. Welcomed by this varied global audience, the movie started with the incident at the cafe, showing the terrible truth of racism many in the audience screamed at, devoid of any nuance. Clearly at Bill's first Robert treatment, but as the narrative developed, demonstrating the attitude in the theater changed with the change of both people and the whole community. By the time the credits, suddenly there was no dry eye in the house. The applause was tremendous and continuous. Robert Daniel and Bill encountered a standing as they headed to the stage for a Q&A session. One attentive and questioning audience member asked Robert how he had discovered the strength. Before responding with his emotionally charged voice, Robert stopped to forgive him. Forgiveness is about choosing to not let hate destroy you. It is not about dismissing what happened. It is about seeing everyone, including those who have offended you, is human. It is not easy, but it is essential if we are to proceed as. Another audience member asked Bill what he would say to people who possessed another viewpoint. Bill inhaled, his hands reflecting identical prejudices to those he used to possess. Tightly gripping the platform, I would advise them that clinging to hate simply damages you and blinds you to the beauty of human variety and the range of experiences you can have when you let others into your heart. I lost so many years of rage and dread do not produce the same error I did. The effect of the documentary was millions of people could access it since a big streaming service grabbed it right away and widely distributed it. The narrative of the veterans' table spurred discussions about race among viewers all over. Reconciliation and community healing in boardrooms and living rooms all around, maybe the most important in living rooms, felt closer to home. In the months following the documentary's publication, the Veterans Table became a sort of pilgrimage destination for people from all throughout the nation, and even from outside, to visit the diner for ourselves to feel the healing and welcoming environment they had created. Robert, Daniel, and Bill discovered themselves in demand as speakers for events emphasizing racial equality and community building, as well as conferences. Reconciliation, they told their narrative nonstop, stressing constantly that what they had accomplished could be done anywhere. With dedication and empathy, the diner itself kept on. Change with a flood of guests, they grew their business, always keeping veterans first. Support and community healing, they began a mentoring program matching veterans with at-risk young people in the initiative was a great success, guiding and supporting young people while giving veterans a rebuilt sense of direction. As the months went by, the effect of the veterans table started to flow in unanticipated directions. Other communities, motivated by their narrative, started to construct. People were gathering together their own versions of the diner, from little communities in the Midwest to major coastal cities, to strive toward mending. One day, about a year after the long-standing divisions and help to heal, John got a call from a well-known national civil rights organizer that left him startled. After viewing the video, their tale impacted them much, and they wanted to invite Bill and Robert Daniel to their yearly conference to go over their experiences and offer their observations on racial reconciliation and community healing. The day of their visit, to walking through the halls lined with activists and leaders in civil rights, the conference was surreal. Couldn't help but consider the distance they had traveled from a small-town diner to a national platform. Their path had been. Their conference talk humbled and motivated the audience, who listened carefully as they told their tale and asked intelligent questions and expressed respect for what they had done. Accomplished what you have done, as the president of the group remarked, offers a road plan for community healing. You have demonstrated across our country that change is achievable even in the face of ingrained prejudice and historical divides. As they exited the conference, the company declared they would be setting up a national, inspired by the Veterans Table, to advance community healing and racial harmony all throughout the nation. Robert, Daniel, and Bill were invited to serve as program consultants. The news of the conference and the new effort attracted fresh focus on the Veteran Table. News teams descended on the little town, ready to record the response of the society to this most recent advancement. Among all the buzz and media coverage, Robert, Daniel, and Bill stayed concentrated on the current task, since they understood that real change does not result from great gestures or national awareness, but from daily activities of people dedicated to change back at veterans, continuing to find comfort and support inside the diner's walls. Community members from over meals, many walks of life, came together to share tales and link splits. And Bill, once the face of discrimination in the town, proceeded on his path of development and atonement. Just when the sun was sinking and Robert discovered Bill lost in front of the painting, last patrons were leaving. In mind, penny for your ideas, Robert asked to be at his side. Bill was silent for a bit before answering. I was simply considering my father and how gently he expressed his pride would be of what we have achieved here, and how depressed he would be that he squandered so many years in wrath. And Robert nodded, bitterness, knowing the complicated feelings Bill was experiencing. Your father's path reminds us strongly that it is never too late to alter his narrative, and part of what makes this location so unique. As they observed the mural showing troops of all stripes as races stood together, they heard the door open behind them and turned to see Daniel looking excitedly on. Daniel said, brandishing a letter in his palm. Music? You're not going to believe this, Daniel said. We've been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Robert and Bill traded startled looks. The Nobel Peace Prize. It seemed nearly unthinkable that their small-town diner could be regarded for such a great honor. The nomination notes our efforts in racial healing in communities. Daniel kept reading from the letter we sent, saying we might offer a model for handling deep-seated. As the news sank in, John, society divisions in a benign and transforming manner mixed with of emotions flow over him, pleasure in what they have accomplished, humility in the face of such praise, and a renewed will to keep on their good effort. John grinned broadly. I suppose we should return to work, as we have much more healing to do. On his face, Bill nodded in accord, and Daniel laughed at his father's subdued response to such historic news. As they in the diner that evening, the three guys couldn't help but consider the incredible journey that had taken them From a single act of discrimination to a movement altering lives all throughout the country, this point marks the Veteran Table has evolved from being merely a diner to a beacon of hope, proving the force of pardon and a living model of what is possible when people gather to mend old wounds and create a better future. When they left throughout the still night, the neon sign of the Veteran Table glowed warmly behind them, a monument to the light they had brought into a world sometimes darkened by division and hate. The narrative of Robert Louis, Daniel Lewis, and Bill Thompson was far from over. Actually, in many respects, it seemed like it was only starting with every person they touched, each community they inspired, and every obstacle they removed was authoring a fresh chapter in the continuing narrative of America's journey towards actual equality and knowledge. And it all began with a little act of Congress. Forgiveness in a little town diner. What would you have done if you, in Robert Lewis's shoes, would you have had the will to forgive and produce something constructive from a? If you like this unpleasant experience, let us know your opinions below. Tale, as much as we did, I handpicked this next one that will warm your heart. Please don't miss it. Click here. View it. Disclaimer. This channel stands against all forms of intolerance, discrimination, racism, and violations of human rights. The stories shared here are original creations, developed to encourage reflection, understanding, and constructive dialogue. All content is produced with a commitment to respecting diversity and honoring human dignity.